So with actionable insights and practical advice, you're going to leave each session feeling very confident and prepared to take on this fundraising process. So it is my pleasure to introduce Najee Barnes McFarlane. He is an investment associate for Techstars Silicon Valley programs, Oakland powered by JP Morgan, and Future of E-commerce powered by eBay. He leads the sourcing and selecting for the program. He previously worked as a consultant, helping a handful of early stage founders raise over $15 million in seed and Series A funding. He's also a recovering entrepreneur and co-founder in the climate space. Also speaking today is Jonathan Moe, who is the investment principal on the New York City JP Morgan program. He previously spent 5 years as an early stage VC investor focused on frontier technologies, industrials, and machine learning / AI, and has invested in 13 seed deals, written over 50 full memos, and sourced over 3,000 startups. He previously worked for a variety of different ventures that include Alumni Ventures, Avery Dennison Ventures, as well as SVB. Originally a scientist, he studied astrophysics, biology, political theory, economics, and medicine. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Karina. That was great. Are we now, do we start? Okay, cool. So yeah, look, Najee, I think, and myself, super excited here. They handed me the list this morning, people attendees. I thought maybe there were like 10, 20 people. So we've got hundreds here, so welcome. Certainly a little more pressure. Yeah, so I'm actually here in New York. Najee, you're out in Oakland, correct? California?
Correct.
All right, so we got bi-coastal kind of crew here as well. Here's how was my intention of how to run this. First off, you should know this is the same talk that actually I give for in-program accelerator startups. So it's the real stuff. You were given a link. There should be a link in the calendar invite, and we can drop it in the chat box as well. That link is to a spreadsheet. Doesn't look like much at first, but there's actually a lot of really significant information in there. And that's going to form the basis of the talk today, which is essentially about what materials do you need as a startup to approach a venture capital investor or potentially an angel investor. So in theory, any investor. So this is something we talk about in the program quite a bit. Techstars, of course, one of its primary goals is to prepare early stage companies to raise additional capital, whether they're in program, during our demo days, or after. And so this is part of the training that we provide in-house companies or portfolio companies to do this. So for the first 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk alongside Najee. Najee, by the way, jump in anytime if you want to say something, because otherwise I'll talk for a long time. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, but then we will leave the back half for questions. Now, I know there are a lot of you, okay? So we're definitely not going to be able to answer everyone's questions. I apologize in advance for that. However, we will select from the Q&A box, so just use the Q&A feature in Zoom in the window below. We will select the questions where I think have the most applicability, and particularly ones that we can answer. So, okay, so with that, let's get started. So I'm actually going to share the screen. Now, this is again the link that you were all sent. So, all right, it says I'm screen sharing. And I'll just get Najee confirm you see that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, and it's okay, excellent. Okay, so cool. So the basic premise here is, as an early stage company, right, you're approaching investors who you may have varying levels of contact with, right? In some cases, you may know them. Okay, if they're angel investors, a lot of startups at Techstars raise family and friends rounds, as we call it. So they raise money from people they already know. Now, in those cases, the approach to the investor can be quite informal, right? If you're asking your uncle to invest in your startup, right, it's less likely, unless he's like a professional investor, that he's going to want to see, let's say, a pitch deck. Okay, maybe, I don't know, these days. But that's sort of one layer here. I think for the most part, though, Techstars tends to prepare companies to speak with what we'll call professional investors. Okay, so these are generally angel investors who have made seed, pre-seed, or even later investments before, or of course, what everybody wants, which are approaching actual venture capital funds. So these funds, of course, vary from micro funds, super angel funds, your traditional seed funds, all the way up to kind of your gigantic Sequoias and these types of very famous VC firms. So in all of those instances, though, you do need materials when you approach those investors, okay? Whether or not you've been introduced by someone, which in theory is usually preferable, or you're cold emailing the investor, right? Like, I mean, famously, people on Twitter, I believe, will email or tweet at Mark Cuban, right? And he's sort of very famous for responding to like cold, random people who he doesn't know, who send him interesting companies asking him to invest in them. So the kind of training is really about how do you do that, right? Like, how do you maximize your opportunity to get in front of an investor? How do you maximize the opportunity of them responding to you? And in particular, how do you do it such that you start off on the right foot, so that way if the investor does talk to you, you can actually go forward with the fundraising process with them. So what we're going to do is we're going to run down this spreadsheet, which basically has all of the materials that we at Techstars require all of our startups to actually produce. Okay, now most of these are just documents, okay? But nevertheless, each of them has a kind of particular format, way in which it's produced, language which is used, which we're going to briefly go over. So, move this at the same time. Okay, so the first thing is your pitch. Okay, we spend a lot of time at Techstars focusing on pitching. Now I should note, and Naji here with me, every program is a little different at Techstars, so you should keep that in mind. We do run over 50 accelerator programs, many of which are ongoing at the same time. So currently, I'm in program. Naji, you're also in program. So so keep that in mind. That being said, we do focus on pitching quite a bit. We practice pitching with our companies. We bring in many outsiders often to help with pitching. But the basic premise is simple. Okay? You need to be able to tell me as an investor what your company does in a pretty short period of time. You'll hear the infamous elevator pitch, right? Where you got 15, 30 seconds, you got stuck with the investor in an elevator, God help them. And you have to kind of sell them on your company, right? You want to tell them what you do and you want to generate interest. And I'm going to highlight those two words, generate interest, okay? That is the objective of all of the stuff on this Excel sheet, okay? I think founders sometimes get a little too wrapped up in this, thinking that, well, if I do the deck a certain way, the way that guy Mo, like and Naji said, like the investors will start writing checks. Like obviously that's not how it works, right? The sole premise here is you want to generate interest from the investor in talking to you more. Okay. Generally speaking, they're going to invest in you, frankly, after talking to you and analyzing your materials, markets, financial models. If you have a product, they're going to want to eat it, taste it, use it, ride it, whatever, right? So, keep in mind that the materials are not an end unto themselves, right? They are a means to an end, and that end is, generally speaking, in this case, to get an investor to talk to you all the way to the end, and then eventually wire you some money, to be blunt.
I think, can I add something there? I think like piggybacking off of that, because I think the point that you're kind of getting to as well is that a lot of people think of this as like, it's just a straight up application. And it's like, my college app where I submitted everything, they just reviewed that. They didn't need to talk to me. They're going to just tell me I'm accepted or not, or they're going to give me the money or not. And it's really not like that. I think a lot of times it's more about it's relationship building, really. This is an industry that's very much so built on relationships, and you kind of getting gradually into that is what warms an investor up to say, yeah, let's talk more, because especially at the earlier stages, it's not so much about your business that's going to matter. It's also about like who you are as an individual founder or team that's going to be more impactful. So like these earlier pitches is kind of just warming them up to say, like, this is somewhat interesting. You seem to be onto something. I think you might be interesting to talk to and work with. Let's talk and let's have a thorough conversation and see if I should actually give you some money, or maybe I give you something else. Maybe I give you introductions. Maybe I just mentor you for the time being till when you're at a stage where it's financially makes sense for me to invest in you. But don't think of it as just like, I just submitted this, like, they're going to give me a check or not.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, triple down on this, right? Like, make sure you get this concept before we even go through this Excel. Like, do all this stuff, do it well, 100%, right? Make sure your stuff is perfect. That's very important. Okay, no errors. I don't want to see spelling mistake. Like, okay. But nevertheless, as Najee said, it's about starting that relationship with the investor. And frankly, especially in the current environment, that relationship may go on for quite a while before we actually generate what we want out of it, whether it's an investment, a connection, an introduction. All right, so the pitch, therefore, is kind of its own whole universe, right? There's pitch coaches, there are billions of videos you can watch about how to pitch your startup, right? How to summarize it. I think, so we do provide, if you click, there should be samples there. One or two of the links may be a little shaky because you guys are outside Techstars. If that's the case, don't worry, I will fix them after, and I'll make sure you get some interesting samples. For the other documents, I'm actually going to be using samples from my current program, which I helped the startups produce. You're getting some real material there. But in terms of the pitch, right, I think 15, 30 second, 1 minute, those are all correct. We also at Techstars emphasize a 3-minute pitch as well. That's something that many programs will do. Whichever you use, right, it has to be clear. It has to be concise. It should be interesting, hopefully, depending on what you're doing, I guess. But most importantly, it's meant to get the investor to ask more, right? So it's a double click effort. It is kind of a clickbait kind of thing, right? Like, you want them to click more to read more. Right? Nobody's investing you after a 1-minute pitch, okay? That's not going to happen. But they may actually ask you for your 10-minute pitch. They may ask you for the 45-minute call, right? The infamous first call with the VC, okay? So that's where you want to go with this. So think of it as constantly rocket boosting. You're just trying to boost further and further, deeper into the chain. So that's the pitch. And again, we're not really going to go pitching on this call, but that just realize that's a whole world on its own. So definitely have that though. Generally speaking, those pitches are verbal, but pitching with a deck is something else sort of in itself. So you have a visual now. That's something that we also practice here a lot at Techstars is how to pitch verbally, but also use a visual. So that's kind of that. Moving on, just keeping on time. So investor pipeline. This is super straightforward, and yet can sometimes, I think, trip up some startups. So basically, this is a spreadsheet. Okay, so you go in Excel, Google Sheets, whatever, and you put a list of the investors, okay, who you are interested in speaking with. Now, how do you get this list? There are lots of different ways. I have seen startups ask for friends who have access to these sort of newfangled databases, things like PitchBook or Traction. And they download huge lists of hundreds of investors that theoretically meet their criteria, and they put them in there. Is that okay? Yeah, sure, that's okay. Another way is they start putting people who they know who could be investors. Like literally, they'll start putting wealthy, high net worths, right? They'll start putting their friends and family, whatever. It's less significant for me, at least in the beginning, of who's on the list, more that you have the list and the list makes sense. Okay. So I saw a startup put Mark Benioff, the, I believe, billionaire founder of Salesforce, on their list. And I was like, do you know Mark Benioff? And they're like, no. I was like, well, then why is he, why is he on the list? And like, well, I'm interested in talking to him. And I was like, okay. And like, what do you do? It's like, well, we make like soap and stuff. I was like, does he invest in that? They're like, no. So it's kind of like, be careful who you put on the list. Like, it should make sense, right? Don't worry if you've only got like 5 or 6 investors in the beginning. That's more than enough, okay? I think, Techstars companies have been very effective at this. We've had companies that literally started with 0 names on the list, and they raised their round before demo day. So it does happen. Don't worry about that. Just make sure that when you're looking for investors, they make sense for what you're doing. There's some plausible reason that you're on their list. I would also say that, when you start making these lists, people will start just adding names. So they go on LinkedIn, the LinkedIn algorithm will start recommending people who are similar, right? So suddenly you're finding lots of investors, let's say in fintech or consumer, whatever, at your stage. I think what happens is they get really into that, so putting more names on the list, and they forget to keep the list updated. So if you jump down to line 5, it's a little separated for some reason on this list, but investor CRM. So that's very much linked to investor pipeline, right? In the sense that it's a list of the investors, and then the CRM component is like all the information that's relevant to the investors. Okay, so what stage do they invest in particular? Keep that in mind. What verticals do they invest in? A generalist investor? Are they specialized and only invest in fertility? Okay, this kind of thing. That's something that you really want to have like early on, okay, because it gets very messy very quickly, right? Because you're going to start emailing people. Some of those will be cold emails, some of them are introductions. Like if someone introduced you, for instance, to that investor, that should be in your CRM. Again, we say CRM, but like you can certainly use an Excel or a Airtable. So however you do it, and we do have some recommended, I think, so we talk about like you can do Airtable, Notion, Streak. There's Founders Suite, which some people here at Techstars use. I've seen like some startups splurge and they pay for stuff. You can Pipedrive, whatever. Fundamentally, they're all spreadsheet programs, right? They make your life maybe a little easier, maybe a little, I don't know. But either way, make sure the information for each investor is going into this thing, and you're updating it. Make sure when they email you back, that gets tagged in the CRM, okay? More enterprising founders figure out you can automate, well, some or maybe all of that. So I feel like, if you're good at that, it could be worth it, okay? If you're not good at it, maybe find someone who is. And even so, if you're not good at it, you can do it manually, okay? It doesn't actually take as much time. It's just more of a habit. So you have to get into constantly keeping track. We've had, no names, but like we've had companies that investors actually reached out to them and they forgot to get back to them. So it's kind of like, don't do that, right? That is the entire reason that we recommend here that you have a pipeline document and a CRM alongside it to track that stuff. Because you do not, the worst thing, of course, is an investor is interested in talking to you, okay? So they did that work for you, and then you forget to get back to them. And it's a lot easier than you think, right? Because once you start going, you're running your company, you're talking to customers, and then a VC just kind of pops into your email. You're like, oh, that's great, hooray, right? Investor wants to talk to me, and you just forget about it. So don't let that happen. And best way is probably a CRM. Now, do you want to add anything on the CRM investor pipelines side of things?
I think you covered most of it and a lot of the good tools. Like I can just speak like anecdotally because I worked with a lot of founders raising venture capital and kind of organizing this process. Like personally, I really liked Streak because it had also just like attached to my email, so I could, as you mentioned, like easily tag everything and just even the views on DocSend, I could just add to their like little box. It was a pretty nice tool for that. I think the other piece, and you mentioned like kind of keeping all your notes and like updating about the like the relationship and the status and where you're going and like to-dos. I think the other thing that is useful, and I wasn't sure, it kind of fits into the investor pipeline, but when doing your research about the investors, I would say just when you are identifying names on the list, like as Jonathan said, like I think you need to be very try to hone in on like really who is going to be a good fit, because one of the big things is like you don't want to be emailing like the wrong people, and not only is it like kind of defeating because you're probably going to get a lot of no's or no responses at all, but I think it's also you want to make sure you're not like wasting anyone's time and you've done your due diligence and the homework as far as, figuring out like maybe some of the companies that they've invested in that align with like that the industry makes sense, maybe checking out what their investment size is. Some of the VCs will like just list that on their website. If not, like you can kind of extrapolate that from data from like Crunchbase or things like that. I think it's really important to kind of get some of that as well into your overall pipeline so that you just have a better sense for like kind of like how to run your process and make sure you're reaching out to the right people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, here, like internally at Techstars, right? This stuff is all, we talk about this stuff all day, right? So, we sometimes forget about this, like even here in Techstars, I think, or I do. But like the VC space is pretty small, okay? So to be blunt, what I usually tell my cohort as well, like don't start just spamming investors is basically what we're kind of saying here to some extent, right? It's like rationally, it kind of makes sense, right? Because you're like, well, I need to talk to investors. I know, they're not all going to get back to me, so why don't I just send an email to like 4,000 of them, right? Because I've got this list, and that generally is not that effective. Okay. Now, to be fair, if you've used like all this stuff, all the documents here, will you get some responses? Maybe. Okay. Is it good for you long term? Definitely not. Okay. The VC space is quite small. And it's a lot smaller than you think. Once you start actually talking to investors, we rep, even in the cohort, we have 12 companies, right? One company talking to an investor, suddenly we didn't even know, but suddenly they started contacting our other startups, even though we had never told them about them and they had never asked, right? The VCs just find out, okay, because it's a pretty small world and they talk to each other pretty much all the time. So yeah, so I would caution against that. Try not to get spammy, okay? And that's because to our line number 4 here, which is our process starter email. So this segues nicely into this. This is, of course, generally this is referring to a cold email where you don't know the investor, you had no prior contact, you're just getting an email. Now, the same thing that still holds true though if you were introduced, okay? So let's say I sent a VC an email and I'm like, hey VC, like here's a cool company, they want to talk to you. Okay, do you want to talk to them? So that's what we call a two-way opt-in. Okay, so I ask permission first from the investor, would you like to take an introduction to this startup? They then have the option to decline and say, yeah, I'm not, I don't like them. Or they're not a fit for my fund, whatever. In which case then it terminates. On the other hand, they may say, yeah, hey, that's really interesting. Why don't you connect me with them? Okay. And in which case, when you respond, right, remember, always be selling, always be trying to get to the next meeting. You're going to want to have an email, even if you're introduced, right, which quickly brings the investor up to speed with what you're doing, who you are, why you were introduced to them, right, and why they should get excited about talking to you because you're about to get on their calendar. So that's what this email is. Okay. Now again, I do caution against templating too much. Like templates are okay, but because I believe we share a sample template here. Yeah. So be careful with templates. Okay. Like for instance, I think a bad move would be to just take that template that we're sharing there and just like fill it in. Like don't do that generally. Okay. You do want to, as much as possible, like tailor your email. Okay. Whether that's tailored to the investor. So if it's a cold email, right, you're going to want to put a little bit more upfront in that email, acknowledging, hey, like you don't know who I am. Okay. And I found you on LinkedIn, I added you on LinkedIn or whatever. I saw you on Twitter. But here's why you should talk to me. Okay. There are a lot of tactics here, and we go into some Techstars, not on this particular webinar, but there are a lot of tactics for how to generate a little bit of what we'll call it warmth. Okay. Sometimes that is simple stuff, like we know the same people. LinkedIn is obviously very helpful here. It tells you who knows them or who's added them. If you actually do know the same people, that might suggest it'd be better to, if you could get introduced, that could be better. But you could also, that doesn't always scale. I appreciate that. Sometimes you could just mention, hey, I know, Tom, I know him too. That's one way. Talking about their portfolio is another way. If they've invested in similar companies to you, or at least look similar, right? Like, hey, I saw you invested in early stage pre-seed fintech. You invested in this mortgage company. We also do mortgages. Maybe there's something to talk about here. Okay. So, and again, you can go over all these tactics, but that's generally what is in this email. I also recommend keeping it short. And it's funny coming from me because I am infamously verbose. Okay, and I talk forever. I write tons of stuff, pages and pages. So it's particularly difficult for me to do this. But I concur with those who have said, like, make sure this email is short. Investors get thousands of emails. I mean, some of them get thousands of emails per day. Okay. So like the chances that they get to the end of your email, no matter how short, is unlikely. So make sure this stuff is front loaded and every single word is carefully chosen, that they're not going to be deleting this email. They're actually going to read it. Yeah, that's kind of what I've sent an email. Again, just to differentiate, your cold email, right? That's we don't know anything. about the investor. They don't know you. You never met them before. And then you have different shades of that, going all the way to like, I don't know, you went to college with this investor and you're old friends, right? In which case, of course, there should still be something in the email, right? Which is connecting them. It's clarifying what you're looking for. I think that's something that sometimes gets lost, right? You want to clarify that you are a startup looking for an investment, you're offering an investment opportunity. You know, you can titrate that to some degree. So for instance, maybe you met them at an event, right? And they already know you're a startup and they already know you're out there raising. Maybe you don't emphasize that on the first email, right? Maybe you're saying, hey, I saw something cool, new technology that I was reading about that I know you're interested in. If you have 15 minutes, I'd love to catch up sometime. Okay. This is also, of course, the email where you can, when it works, you can request in-person meetings. There's kind of a whole, black art, and I think the text art, like we debate this in my team a lot too. Like, should you ask to meet them in person? Like, how likely is that? Should you instead say, no, forget about that. Let's see if we can get them on a call. I'm agnostic on that. I think that it just varies heavily on the situation. Okay. But just keep in mind, like, this is the email where you're going to you have to make that decision. Like, what is the ask? Okay. I remember when I emailed a VC once when I was looking for my first job in VC, and I emailed them, and I thought it was pretty obvious that I wanted to work at their fund. They actually literally responded like, I have no idea what the ask is here. And I wrote this like whole email, and I was like, oh, okay. So in my following email, I was like, I'm interested in working at your fund. And they were like, oh, okay, let's talk. So make sure the ask is clear, okay, in some way. And it doesn't mean you have to hit them up now being like, here's my IBAN number, please wire money, right? Like, don't do that, okay? But, keep it such that they understand who you are, what kind of email is this, who are these people, what do they want from me, okay? Because VCs are getting asked for stuff all day long, okay? This is the whole process, once again, coming back to that thing, generate interest, right? That's kind of the objective. So that's on the email. All right, moving on, because so forwardable blurb. Okay, this one I'm going to dilate a bit on, because in my experience, including here at Techstars, this has been one of the most important things actually that we've done, which is literally writing the blurb. So I know this link works because it's mine. So if you click on the actual blurbs, it's the notes samples on line 6. These are actual blurbs. So a blurb, just to be clear, is a small paragraph, right, which succinctly summarizes the company, what it does, and essentially the investment opportunity surrounding it. Okay, so that's a blurb. And it says here personal context, written one-liner, 1 to 2 traction metrics plus the S. Yeah, that's a blurb. Okay, and these are actual blurbs for our program. Najee, you can feel free to, if you want to link your programs in there too when we're done, so they can see those. But so these are actual blurbs. Okay, in this case, the startups wrote some of them. I rewrote them. Blurbs are themselves kind of a bit of an art form, actually. I've seen all kinds of different blurbs, actually. So I'm not trying to be prescriptive here into how you write your blurb. But I think what you will notice if you read the samples is a couple things. First is they're about the same length, okay? So we're talking like 6, 7 lines. Anything more than that, now it's not a blurb, okay? So definitely restrict that, the length. Definitely tighten the language, okay? So it doesn't necessarily look like it, but those blurbs took a very long time actually to write here. They were pretty carefully crafted in most cases. You want to use as few words as possible to very clearly mechanically describe what this company is doing, okay? Now, that doesn't mean it has to be boring. Some of these blurbs may be a little boring. You guys can opine on that in the chat if you want. But the basic premise here is to communicate to the investor, okay, in their language, what they understand, okay, why they should click on this company. Okay, and by the way, these links don't work here for privacy reasons, but normally the title, so if you click on the company's name, like the first company I think is Champion 40, if you click on that, usually that would be a link to either a deck, which we will talk about, or like a one-pager. So basically additional material. Sometimes it goes to the website, but we generally don't recommend that. Usually if they click on that, that's great time, by the way, that's what you want. You want them to click on that. They will then go to your deck. okay? In which case now you're bringing them even deeper into the story, into the company, okay? And then of course, what we really want is we want them to sign up to talk to you. So that's the blurbs. Again, this webinar is not really about how to write blurbs, but spend a lot of time on it is my point, okay? And here's the reason why. The reason why you spend a lot of time is when people introduce you to investors, and introductions are, depending who you ask, anywhere from a third to half of a lot of the deal flow that investors get. They come through other people who either know them, who they met, whatever. So introductions are important. The introduction will almost always come with a blurb. And by the way, if there isn't a blurb, almost without fail, the investor will ask for it, okay? Because they generally are not going to, in my experience, they will not book a call with someone based on like a single line. Like, oh, this company does, mortgage lending in the SMB space for, small business real estate. And it's just like, okay, that's interesting, but like I'm not booking out 30 minutes of my precious time on that. I'm going to be more than that, okay? And so the blurb really helps them make that initial determination, okay? Now, the reason the blurb is so important, though, is in most or many cases, it may be the only thing the investor ever sees for your company, okay? Investors pass very quickly and overwhelmingly, okay? So they see thousands of startups every year. Look at any portfolio, right? It's generally 20 to 50 companies. So we already know that 99% of the time, they're saying no, okay? And in many cases, that they're saying no, never having talked to the company. Okay. So the question then is, if the blurb is your first and possibly your last chance, right? Make sure it is written in a way that communicates why you're so excited about the company, okay, the opportunity. Make sure they get it is basically my point. And test it out too, okay? Like, don't feel, all these things are fluid, okay? We had a startup, by the way, these blurbs that I shared with you were edited as of, I think, a few hours ago, okay? Because one company had told me that they talked to an investor and they were slightly confused about something. And I was like, okay, let's clean that up in the blurb. Let's fix it, okay? So, A/B test it, however you want to do it, but make sure you're always, it's an organic thing, right? The blurb is a communications tool. You're trying to get interest. So if you're sending out your blurb and people you think should be talking to you, not talking to you, maybe we have to change that. So real quick on the link. So as I mentioned, usually you'll click, there'll be a link. I do recommend, Naji can opine here as well. I mean, I have seen some success with people who use something like a DocSend to host the deck. It's just a little easier, I think, because normally when you ask someone to, by the way, the reason it's called a forwardable blurb is because we're referring to an introduction. So this is where I'm introducing you to an investor. So I'm forwarding this, and so I'm sending, that's what's called forward. It's a little annoying for me to have to attach a PDF deck. Now look, I love PDFs actually, and investors do like PDFs. But generally speaking, I'm not prescribing it, but I do think that DocSend kind of works pretty well. So that's my little plug for DocSend. So yeah,
not sponsored by DocSend.
Not sponsored, correct. Okay, so the next, Naji, sorry, did you want to add?
No, I agree with everything you said. I think for me, we're not getting into the details of like blurb writing, but I would say keep it short as well, especially for forwardable things, because I definitely don't want to send like paragraphs on paragraphs about the company to someone. It's like, if you should be able to communicate and make me excited within like 2 or 3 lines, and that should be enough to make the intro, and the investor can use the relationship that I have with them to then take the meeting,
Agree. So, okay. Once you've got your blurb written, we then of course want to produce those materials which are going to link to it. So this is where I'm kind of going to discuss all of these in the same kind of sentence, because they're basically all variants of each other. So this is line 7, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9. So basically these are, we'll go in reverse. So investor deck, I'm sure everybody on the call knows about what a deck is, okay? This is your classic multi-slide, I'm not gonna, again, it won't be prescriptive, but we see a lot of like anywhere from 10 to 20 slides, 14, 12, this kind of thing. You can read, there's all kinds of people who have different theories about how many slides you should have. But point is, the investor deck okay, is distinct. So we're just trying to separate it here from, let's say, the pitch deck, okay, which is line 10. So the pitch deck are often more visual slides. This is what like you put up behind you. So for instance, a Techstars demo day where you're presenting to an audience and you have a limited period of time, like a few minutes usually, your pitch deck will be behind you. These are often like pictures, and people use videos. They're meant to be a little bit more engaging than like a read through deck. So in many ways, that is a separate product that you create, pitch deck. So just want to make that distinction. Okay, the investor deck, the teaser deck, and the company one-pager, these are generally all variants of each other. Okay, so you know, they're, for instance, they will often carry the same branding. If you have like your logo and color scheme, whatever it is, they will often carry over through all these. And they're, you know, there's a lot written here, I guess, but like they're pretty much, and you can also click the samples, by the way, those are real samples. So it's a real one-pager, a real teaser, and a real investor deck from the New York City current cohort. Those are the real stuff that they're using right now. I should also note it took them a long time to produce those, so don't think that it didn't look like that the first time. So there's a lot of work goes into these. And they're pretty much what they say, right? So the company one-pager is literally one page. I've seen some people get cute, though. Apparently, like you can get these super long scroll PDFs that are like not one page, really. They're technically one page, I guess. You know, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but whatever it is, it's meant to be a very short, okay, succinct description of the company. So you know, usually a picture of your product or a picture of the screen or whatever. Elaborating on the blurb. Okay, so more information than the blurb, typically leaning a little bit more into the business angle, right? So sometimes one pagers will have things like markets, or they'll have things like, you know, our unit economics or the yield we get on a certain product, whatever. So that's really what the one pager is trying to elaborate. The teaser deck, and I think it says here, be careful with this. The teaser deck is essentially a shortened version of your full investor deck. Okay. Now, I think at least this cohort, one thing I've seen is people use the one pager a little less, and they even use the teaser deck a little less. Some of them use a teaser. I think this is where you have to kind of make a decision, like depending on your company, its stage, right? How much kind of material you have to share, right? Like we have a company, for instance, doing millions in revenue already, and they've been around for a while. They've, you know, sort of a lot to talk about. So they tend to send a full investor deck, and they still made the one pager, the teaser deck, but they tend to, in the blurb, they link to the deck. They have found that that's kind of a faster way for them to get investor eyes. We have another company, though, for instance, that is very early, and they prefer using, let's say, a teaser deck. So they have kind of 5 slides, really gets the idea across really succinctly what they're doing, and it's kind of very exciting at the end. They have like a link to a video, and it's like, here's the video. You gotta talk to us, right? So again, these are sales documents, right? In the end, like, you know, generate interest. So which of these you use and in which format is going to be up to you and your advisors and, you know, kind of and your testing, frankly, in the market, right? So if you're sending one pagers and nobody's, you know, doesn't seem to be working, like maybe change that up a little bit, right? Send them the whole deck. Maybe there's something that is missing there. Ask people, ask other investors, et cetera, if you can. So that's kind of on the deck. Naji, you want to say anything about decks?
No, I think you covered that. Decks are pretty.
Yeah, so certainly we link that to the blurb. Okay, and I know we're a little over time because I want to make sure it's questions. So real quick, financial model. Okay, this is the financial models are like a very, you know, protracted discussion here at Techstars. Like a lot of startups do struggle with this in some cases, like they're not sure, in other words, how complex the financial model should be, what's supposed to go in there, what it should look like, is there a set format, et cetera. You know, I think, so we put a link there to Forecaster, which is a program that Techstars has a relationship with, actually, and they actually provide some training to our companies. So that's one option. The traditional option is just an Excel, basically create a spreadsheet. And I think, again, this webinar is not really about financial models, other than it's telling you that you should have one. so yes, you should have one. I think what I'll say is there's two variants of this. One variant is like you're like really early. Okay, so you're pre-seed, you really have no revenue yet, let's say, or you have some de minimis revenue. I think in that case, your financial model is more like a projection. Okay, so you're looking more like revenue, it's meant to be a statement about where the company may go financially or could go. Okay. If you do already have revenue, then you're thinking, expenses, a lot of stuff like that. Then you're thinking more, this should look like more of a standard financial model. Doesn't have to be a full-blown like 3-statement DCF or something, which is sort of another thing. As you get later stage, you will have that. So I would think about it like that. But yeah, that's kind of all I'll say on financial models at the moment, just because we're running out of time, and that's also a very deep topic on its own. So, okay, cap table. This is also something where there's a lot of software providers out there, this one in particular. So Carta is a famous one. I think captable.io is another. So there's several providers in this space. The cap table is pretty simple. This is just a record of who owns what shares in the company. Okay? They're important, but in the most of the companies, at least the Techstars ones that I've seen, they tend to have fairly simple cap tables, right? The founder is usually the one, or the founders usually the ones who own most of the shares, and they may have like a few angel investors. If you do, and of course, if you have more than that, typically at that point you would have already been with lawyers, in which case you'll have your cap table already generated. Yeah, I'll also plug here again software. I'm a big software person. I like automating things. So I do like Carta. Techstars companies get Carta, well, for free, depending on how much they've raised. If you've raised under, I think it's $1 million, you get Carta for free for a year. So nice perk for Techstars companies. But yeah, so I do recommend, if possible, using software where you can to automate the cap table. And then the last thing is the data room. So this is, again, pretty self-explanatory, actually. The data room is literally just like a Dropbox. It's usually a server-based file share system where you have all the documents that are related to your company. Okay, so you'll have many of the documents above that we discussed. So you may have the pitch deck. Some people even put the blurb on a document. The financial model will be in there. Other startups will put things like product videos, right? May put customer testimony. It is up to you how much to share in the data room. Generally speaking, if you go to diligence with an investor, they will ask for a lot of stuff that you'll have to provide then. So that's, of course, sort of up to you. I think at minimum, though, in the data room should at least be the deck, okay, and potentially the financial model. Okay, you can also put the cap table in there, depending on privacy. I think some startups freak out a little bit about like sharing stuff with investors. Again, that's kind of up to you. But I think what I would say is have a place where you can put materials that the investor can access, because they'll say, hey, can I see your EDR, electronic data room? And you don't want to be like scrambling that day, like, oh no, what's a data room? So like have a place where you put the stuff, and then as they request stuff, you can drop it there. That is all very standard in the PE VC space. Obviously, data rooms are just the thing. Yeah, so I'm actually, I want to wrap pretty much there, because I want to make sure I know we have a lot of questions. So Naji, you have any final things before we go to questions, or?
No, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with the end. It's all of this, I think, especially at the earlier stages, and I've been seeing some of the questions come in and trying to respond to them. But all of this is just like, all of these materials, to Jonathan's like point, is really just like, these are all great to haves and things that will make it a more efficient process. But even furthermore, it also just shows that like you are prepared to really like go to do this, and I think it speaks volumes. Like even just someone saying like, yeah, I already have a data room. It's like, awesome. Like as an investor, you see that and you're like, cool, you're prepared. You came to class with your pencils and your notebooks and you're ready to learn, and ready to like work. And so I think it's really just like having all of this stuff is like really nice, and like will show that you are a little bit more polished as like a founder or an entrepreneur.
Okay, so I'm just gonna pick some questions like rapid fire here. Real quick before we do that though, I do want to mention, Naji, you can second this, that applications are open for Techstars programs, including Oakland. Is eBay open yet?
Yes, the applications closed July 5th as well. So
okay. So we're saying, okay. And also, of course, for Techstars here in New York City, powered by JP Morgan, which is my team. So absolutely, we encourage, we really want you to apply, frankly. So we'd be very excited to have your application. And they are due, just after the 4th of July weekend. So definitely, get on that now, and feel free to message either of us, email, LinkedIn, whichever. If you want to talk, have any questions, we're always happy to do brief kind of messages back and forth. We will also do some like 10-minute, 15-minute kind of calls if we can, time pending, if you really want to discuss the program deeply after you've communicated with us by email. So that said, let's go to quick questions. So as someone anonymous is asking about the environment. Yeah, look, the environment's not good for early stage startups right now. Okay, it's not like a secret. PitchBook is putting out a lot of data showing that VC funds themselves are having trouble. Okay, they're having trouble raising. So frankly, if the VC funds are having trouble raising, that means you're going to have trouble raising. Okay, it's just that simple. There's no way that doesn't change anything we discussed here, though. This stuff is true whether it's a winter or whether it's like the height of 2021, right? Or if it's 2000. Okay, these materials are merely how you generate interest and communicate with investors. So generally speaking, none of this is altered by the fundraising environment. I think what I would say is it just means you got to do everything a lot better, right? So, the blurb, for instance, you want to make sure that is communicating to the investor as best as you can, as quickly as you can, because it's just going to get more competitive over the next several months. Hopefully, the environment will improve, but at the moment, that's where it is. If you're in an area, not a large startup investor ecosystem, how do you network with investors? Okay. Accelerators are a good option. Techstars is an excellent option. So I will say that. But you're correct. It can be challenging. I think one thing to emphasize there, though, is kind of the power of email. Okay. So, a lot of investors are accustomed to receiving emails, right? Cold emails, they get them all day. They're not the best. Yes, warm introductions are better, right? But I mean, I worked for many years at VC funds, and it was my job to respond to cold emails, and I responded to all of them. So I guess what I would say is, short of moving, I guess, which may or may not necessarily help, right? The Bay Area is filled to the brim with investors. It doesn't make it necessarily easier to find them. Okay. I was just at Tech Week, SF Tech Week LA, and a lot of the founders, right, there were thousands of them. So investors, the last thing they wanted to do was talk to, right, one founder, because then they knew there'd be 50 more they'd have to stay for, right, and discuss. So I would say, leverage email as best you can to perform that outreach. Most investor calls these days are on Zoom. Okay, that's just how it is. Like most of the first meetings do tend to be virtual anyway. Investors are around and traveling and moving. They don't, getting an in-person meeting can be logistically difficult. If you can get one, but I would get comfortable pitching, sharing decks, screen sharing, practice all that stuff. I would get used to doing that virtually, particularly in the early stage. Okay, let's see. Okay, 10-minute warning. Should we Okay, somebody plugging Founder Suite. Yes, that's something Techstars is going to use. Okay. Okay, so someone's asking, our list has 1,000 funds. They want to see the whole thing. So yeah, generally you don't show your list of investors to other investors, generally. Unless they very specifically ask, are you talking to X fund? Because I know that person. Generally, it is your discretion to not necessarily share whom you're speaking with. Like that, technically that's private. Look, you can, of course, there's a lot of game theory around that. If you want to share, hey, I'm talking to Sequoia and Andreessen Horowitz, like, yeah, you may do that. I've seen people do that, but generally you don't share the list of investors with the investor. Now, do you see any questions you want to answer? Or I know you've been answering a lot of them already. Yeah, I see how you. I saw that.
There was a good one that I just saw actually. It was
Okay, while you look for it, I'll throw this one out. So somebody asked about
yeah,
investor newsletter.
there's been a lot.
Investor newsletter, yes, that is a good question. And you're correct, it's not in there. One reason it's not in there is because that's this is really about how you approach the investor. The newsletter, for instance, something else not in here is a thank you email. Okay, absolutely send a thank you email. Okay, if an investor talks to you, if they pass on you, frankly, that's up to you. But I would still send a thank you email. That's kind of just me. But the investor newsletter, yes. So this is something where after you talk to an investor, regardless of the outcome, you can ask them, would you like to be put on our newsletter? We'll email you updates. Okay. I absolutely would do it. So the answer is yes. Okay. Now, if they say no, don't add them to it and spam them. But like if they say yes, put them on it. I think the best I've seen is usually a monthly update. I've seen a few startups send weekly updates. It's probably a little too much. Okay. But like monthly updates seem fair. You can also do it depending on like when you have something exciting to report, maybe every 2 months, get them right. So that is a more longer term relationship building strategy that absolutely you should leverage. And there is of course software out there to help you do that, where you do it manually. I mean, Gmail allows you to do kind of mass emailing pretty quickly.
One of the questions, I'm kind of curious to get your context too, Jonathan. I've seen it a couple of times. Is this for tech companies only? How do you feel about that?
For tech companies only? Ooh, no. So I mean, we have companies in our portfolio that are frankly not technology companies. They're like consumer products, right? For instance, well, I guess it depends what you mean by what is tech. Okay, I think in Silicon Valley, tech tends to be like enterprise software. In which case, then no. I mean, our portfolio is majority not enterprise software, for instance, at the moment, our cohort. So no, this applies for all companies. I used to do deep tech investing, quantum computing, satellite chips, this kind of stuff. And the same rules apply. Okay, they have a blurb, they have a deck. Am I interested? Let's book a call. A little trick I just saw work quite well. You might consider including your Calendly in your deck. I've seen it work where we have some startups, right? You're just reducing that friction, right? So instead of having to email you, the investor's like, I'll click the Calendly, put them on the calendar, forget about it until I have to talk to them, right? It's a little trick that I saw. It's worked really well, actually. I would never have recommended it, which is why I found it interesting, because I didn't think of it, but someone put their Calendly and they're getting some good meetings. So consider that. Okay, so someone's asking, how do you nudge people who offered you a warm introduction? I mean, yeah, I feel like that depends on your relationship with them. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that one. I would say ask them again insistently. I would
It's
also
a relationship game.
Yeah,
How would you ask someone
I'm
to do
not sure
something
about
that you asked them already to do?
Take them for a drink somewhere and like bring it up again. So I'm not sure about that. Let's see.
How do you identify the risks that make a company a bad investment option?
So yeah, I think that would be a different webinar on diligence. So yeah, so VCs will all have different means of doing that, but generally that's something they resolve in diligence. So once you get the first call, they will, by the way, on the first call, they're gonna start asking you about risks. Like that's what they're asking. They're gonna ask about your competitors, they're gonna ask like, how come anyone can't just do this, et cetera. So that's something that will start very quickly, but generally it gets fleshed out in diligence questions, what they call DDQs, or due diligence questions. And they will send those to you generally after the first call, usually. But let me see. Yeah, NDAs, I mean, depends. Some investors sign them happily, others do not like signing them. I think it just varies. I think the general answer is you should get comfortable talking about your startup in a way that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, okay, on material, on IP or anything like that, okay? So kind of draw the line somewhere about what you're willing to share when and kind of stick to it. You know, I'd be careful though about being too reticent. I've seen companies that are like, oh my God, we want to share like our revenue last year. That you won't get very far doing that, right? Like the investor is going to want to know like what your revenue was last year, right? So, you know, that being said, like we want to share our pre-patented, you know, like no. So I would be thoughtful about where you draw the line. Okay, so a couple questions have asked about like outside the US, basically. That's a good question. We have several companies in our current cohort which are based outside the US, South America, Europe, et cetera, Canada. I don't think the rules are different. I know there is this sense that, oh my God, it's, we're outside the US, like who will talk to us? There are some funds which will invest in US only. So you may waste a little time because sometimes it's not obvious. You have to talk to them and find out. They're like, oh, we do US only because it's not on their website or something. But many investors, particularly in the early stage, are usually open to looking outside the US. I don't know, it may make it slightly harder, right, for various reasons. But generally speaking, I've not seen it be as big an issue, I think, as people think. I also know Techstars companies are required to create a legal entity in the US based in Delaware. So all Techstars companies are generally US based. That's another thing to consider.
All right.
Yeah, Corinne, go.
No, yeah, we have time for 2 more questions, and then I'm going to ask you guys to share one tip for when founders
So let me do one more question. Someone says, confused about the process starter email. Looks like they're quoting me. You don't need to mention your fundraising. If yes, okay. So this is a good question. You want to clarify why you're talking to the investor. Okay, so if you are fundraising, generally speaking, I would mention that, okay, in the opening blurb. I do think there are some instances where you may not. Like I said, maybe you met them at an event and you just had a nice discussion about something interesting, like a tech or another company, whatever. And you may want to kind of manage this a little differently. Maybe you don't want to press the fact that you're raising already. Generally speaking, they will already think that you're raising, typically, right? Most VCs who talk to founders who are in either their stage or their vertical or both, there tends to be some assumption that, right, at some point or another, whether it's today, tomorrow, next week, right, you're going to be raising, and they may be a viable discussion. So I don't think, at least in Techstars, like we don't make people kind of like, circle that too much. I think being somewhat direct is okay. Again, don't ask them for like their wire information, but like mention that you're raising a seed round. I mean, I don't say anything. Corinna, sorry.
All right, so before we close out, I want you guys to share a tip for when founders apply to Techstars.
Okay, I'll go first. Tip for applying to Techstars. Fill out the whole application. We have lots of people who just don't do it. So definitely fill out the full application. Oh wait, am I muted?
You're good. No.
Oh, sorry, it says I'm muted. Fill out the full application and have a deck. We do have, now look, it's not required. Some startups do apply, they don't have a deck, and we accept them. Like it does have, so okay. That being said, it makes my life a lot easier having to review over 1,000 applications if you have a slide deck. Because remember, we just went through the checklist and you're gonna have to make one anyway. So you might as well produce a deck for Techstars. So that's me.
I agree with that sentiment. Definitely fill out the application. It makes it very annoying when you like are looking for a particular to answer some question and you're like, I don't see it, and you just kind of have to keep moving and go to the next application. I think as far as like the application itself, or what makes it very interesting for me personally, is when there is some level of intellectual honesty about where you're at with the business when answering more of the qualitative questions. So really helping me see where we as an organization can plug in and help you scale and become that, I think Mael was calling it a dragon, right?
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Naji, for all of your insights. And remember, guys, that we still have one more session in our 3-part fundraising series, which is designed to give you the knowledge and tools that you need to successfully raise capital for your early stage startup. The next session will be the mock investor interview, and that's going to be on Tuesday, June 20th at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. So put that on your calendars. And don't forget to follow us on socials. We are on all of them as Techstars. So let's stay connected. See you guys on the next one.
See you guys.